I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Eric, and thanks everybody for joining us here today. My name is Tim Reardon. I'm the Director of Data Services at the Metropolitan Area Planning Council. MAPC is the regional planning agency for 101 cities and towns in the Metro Boston region. We cover an area population of about 3.4 million people, and we provide technical assistance services to cities and towns, joint purchasing and collective procurement, and have a legislative advocacy program that works both with our legislators and state agencies here in Massachusetts, as well as with our congressional delegation in Washington. My shop focuses on the use of data and technology to support informed decision-making, and I'm sure, like many of you, we rely very heavily on the decennial census information as well as the American Community Survey. What I'm going to be talking about today is a new form of what's called disclosure avoidance that has been proposed for use for the decennial 2020 census. By the Census Bureau. It's been in the works for some time now, a number of years, and I'll walk through the origins of that as well as its implications for all the work that is being done by regional agencies as well as localities on planning and forecasting issues, and then close with some recommendations and observations that we're hoping that stakeholders such as elected officials, regional agencies, and others will express both to the Census Bureau themselves as well as to their elected officials in DC, so that there can be greater awareness about this issue and how it is going to affect the ability of cities and towns and other jurisdictions as well as the regional agencies to do the important work that they're doing. So, census data and privacy protections are, two things that really need to go hand in hand. The Census Bureau is legally mandated by Title 13, Section 9 to protect the privacy of individuals and of households who respond to the decennial census or the American Community Survey. That regulation prohibits the Census Bureau from making, quote, any publication whereby the data furnished by an establishment or individual can be identified. So there, they can't release anything through which you can determine the identification of an individual. The Census Bureau is also mandated to provide reliable data for federal, state, and local decision making, and that includes redistricting and both apportionment and redistricting data. So there are sort of two important charges that the Census Bureau has. One is maintaining privacy, and the other is ensuring the availability of reliable and accurate data for all kinds of legislatively mandated activities and constitutionally mandated activities. And I think when we get into this further, you'll see that the issue of differential privacy is really a matter of how we balance those two concerns that the Census Bureau is grappling with, but so are all of us who are working with data in the public realm. In prior census, the Census Bureau used different ways of protecting privacy in earlier censuses. First by not releasing the individual results for 70 some odd years. Over recent decades, they've used a technique called household swapping, where households of the same size and the same state were sort of switched with each other, and so we don't know exactly how many that is. So the general outlines of the population and the population size and types of households remains the same, but individuals may actually be sort of represented in a different block than where they live. And so, the ability of someone to divine the individual characteristics of someone is reduced there. Recently, the Census Bureau performed what they called a reconstruction attack, or a sort of, an attempt to hack the census's data using the census microdata, the decennial census results from 2010, and then additional commercial data sources that had information about the name, the age, the gender, the address of individuals. So there's as many of you may know, there's lots of sources online where you can get, consumer mailing lists that include incredible amounts of information about individuals and households, the head of the household, the name of that person, their age, their credit history, the kind of car they own, and all sorts of things. And what the Census Bureau did is said, okay, well, if we if we take, it actually wasn't census microdata, that's a slight typo. It was actually the same results, the same data products that we would get from the Census Bureau through SF1 or SF2, and combined those with these external, very rich data sources from commercial providers in order to see if they could do what's enumerated in the second bullet up top, which is identify the data furnished by any particular establishment or individual. What they found was that there was a putative match rate of 45% in the sense that they felt that about 45% of response of individuals who responded to the census could be identified within these commercial data sources. However, when they compared that to the confidential data that no hacker or anybody outside the Census Bureau would have, what they found was that 2/3 of those putative matches were actually false. So really, only 17% of the total population could be matched using this method. And another way of looking at it is that if a hacker were to do this, they would get a match rate of 45%, but 2/3 of those would be wrong. And the only personal attribute that was revealed is the self-reported race and ethnicity, because all the other information that is reported on the census is already available from these consumer data sources. But based on this and concerns about the growing availability of big data sources and computing power to reconstruct individual information, the Census Bureau has made a decision to adopt a new form of disclosure avoidance called differential privacy for the 2020 census, and I'll talk about what that is next. So differential privacy is a fairly recent statistical technique that's designed to manage potential privacy loss in a way that's robust and future-proof. So it's really only been developed in the past 20 years by computer scientists and mathematicians who work on these issues. I'm not going to get into the sort of mechanics of differential privacy or the theory behind it very much, because I want to focus on the impacts of its application to jurisdictions. But at a very high level, what happens is that statistical noise is introduced into the data before they're tabulated. So we add, people of certain characteristics, or we delete people of certain characteristics from the tabulation, and then summarize those. And the amount of noise that's added is determined by this thing called the privacy loss budget, which is also the term, epsilon. You'll see in some of the results. And so the size of the privacy loss budget determines the balance between privacy and accuracy. A higher privacy loss budget means more privacy is lost and there's more accuracy. A lower privacy loss budget means higher privacy and lower accuracy. So the particular term that's used in the equation is called epsilon. You'll see that shortly. So a high epsilon value means a high privacy loss budget, which means a lot of privacy lost and or more privacy lost and more accuracy gained, whereas a low epsilon is high privacy retained, low accuracy. So noise is added at each geographic level. So what happens is we have a national file and noise is added there. Then we have a population for states. More noise is added as it goes down to the county and the tract and the block group and the block level, down that sort of spine of census geographies. So far, the Census Bureau has committed that the state population, which is, as we know, used for apportionment, and the block level housing units as invariant, as in they won't change. But all other population attributes can change. The total number of residents, including residents in households or group quarters, can change differently. The number of households and all the characteristics of respondents and their households, such as their age, their race, their ethnicity, and their tenure. Over and over again, the Census Bureau has reiterated that the balance here between privacy and accuracy is a policy decision, not a technical one. They've produced a technical solution for what they see as the problem of these reconstruction attacks, but acknowledge that where we set that privacy loss budget is a decision about how accurate we need the data versus how much privacy needs to be retained. So a couple of slides on the methods, just so folks kind of understand a little how it works. A highly simplified example from, let's say, from an area with a population of 100, 2 characteristics along the rows, male and female, and then 3 characteristics that have to do with when someone has attended school. So you would take all of the census responses and wrap them into a table like this. Now for the nation, it's going to be, you know, age times race times gender times tenure and all so forth. This is so you'll have a very multidimensional matrix. But in this case, we just have these two dimensions here of school and gender. And what happens with differential privacy is that the number of people represented in each cell is modified. So in this case, we lose one male person who's never attended school. We gain 8 female people who've never attended school. There's no change in the males who are currently attending. There's a loss of 2 females who used to attend school in the past. And so you'll see that the characteristics, the sort of distribution of characteristics within the population changes, as well as the total number of people that are in this area. So not only do we think that more people in this area have never attended school, we just think that there are more people in this area overall. So the way that this works within in differential privacy is that each one of those cells gets a noise that's assigned from this what's called this Laplace distribution. And so the shape of that gray curve in the middle determines so we pick random, we sort of pick randomly from within that distribution. Most cells are going to get something, close to 0, but some may get, added, a considerable amount of noise or reduced by a significant amount. And then this slide here shows kind of a higher epsilon value means that the spread of that curve is much less. The noise that's added to each individual cell will be, plus or minus a small amount. A lower epsilon value, which is a higher privacy loss budget, means more spread, more noise introduced to the data. So that is the end of the equations, but I just want to, and sort of technical presentation of differential privacy there, but really the key thing is the more, the higher the epsilon value or the higher the privacy loss budget, there is more accuracy to the data, but less impact or less benefit from a privacy perspective. And on the flip side, the lower the epsilon value, the lower the privacy loss budget, you get more privacy, but lower levels of accuracy. And you can see here in a slide that was produced last year, which is actually using some data from 2040 or from 1940. Not data from the future, but from the past. And here, the numbers in the top in those gray bars are the epsilon values that were used. So they range from an epsilon value of 0.25 to 8.0. And what you can see is with those lower and the horizontal axis is the actual counts of people in each county, and then the vertical axis is what comes out of the differentially private data when it was done to 1940. And you can see that lower values of epsilon produce a lot more spread, and it's particularly true for counties with small amounts of population. And we'll get into that in more detail. So is it effective? That's really one key question, which is if we're implementing differential privacy in order to protect the privacy of census respondents, the question is, does it work? Census scientists staged another reconstruction attack on the Census 2020 data that had been treated with different levels of differential privacy, so different epsilon values. The very lightest application, that is the highest privacy loss budget, the highest value of epsilon, reduced the confirmed re-identification from 17% to 8.2%. So it cut it by about half, but it did not eliminate it. Lower privacy loss budgets or lower values of epsilon, you can see on this chart here, as you move to the left on the chart, the smaller privacy loss budgets result in marginal reductions in re-identification, but as we'll see later, they also come at greater cost to accuracy. And I think the most important takeaway of this slide is that there's really no application of differential privacy short of altering every individual census response or every individual cell in that multidimensional table would completely eliminate the risk that a hacker could personally identify an individual. So differential privacy does not completely eliminate the risk to a re-identification for an individual unless we completely eliminate all accuracy whatsoever. So that's again, that's the sort of the spectrum here that it's working in. And again, it is really up to policymakers to determine where on this spectrum of accuracy and privacy the Census Bureau should make its technical methods targeted at. So what are the effects of differential privacy on all the data products that we as planners and practitioners and public officials use? We've been able to look at that a little bit with what's called some demonstration data that was released by the Census Bureau that says late 2020, but it should be late 2019. So that was information for every block in the state and all the states, that not for every attribute, but for many of them, where they treated it with an epsilon value of 4, and then released all that data, which allows people to compare what we had from 2010, and then what we would have gotten if they'd applied differential privacy to the 2010 data, so we can sort of see what the differences are. And the Census Bureau is currently seeking feedback, and then they will have committed to using that feedback to modify the implementation of that work. So a couple of observations that we've found, as well as others, partners that we've worked with here in Massachusetts and the Census Bureau themselves. Number one is that differential privacy produces a systematic undercount for in more populous tabulation areas. So whether it's counties within states or tracts within counties or block groups within tracts, there's a tendency for those larger tabulation areas within the hierarchy to be undercounted. And the reason for this is because smaller areas can have none of those cells can go below 0. And so if you have a value of 4 people in a given cell, and the noise that's added to that is supposed to be -8, you can't do that. You can drop it to 0, but you've got to get the other 4 taken out of somewhere else, and they tend to come out of the larger tabulation areas within a given level of hierarchy. So here you can see that in Massachusetts, the municipalities that saw the biggest losses and systematically biggest losses were some of our larger communities. And the numbers are not huge, but they are systematic. And the Census Bureau has found a similar trend when looking across counties. Again, this is using an epsilon. This is some analysis that was presented at a workshop in December by Census Bureau scientists. In this case, using epsilon of 4, which is the same as we saw for the demonstration data. On the bottom there, it's counties are grouped according to their population in 2010, with the largest counties on the right and the smallest counties on the left. And you can see that those largest counties are systematically lower and basically have a decline in population, and those that are smaller actually see increases in their population with the application of differential privacy. However, it's not all great for those smaller jurisdictions and tabulation areas, because while they tend to see some increase in population, they also see much more variability and a huge range of uncertainty, because differential privacy produces systematically higher levels of inaccuracy for less populous statistical areas. So the smallest municipalities in Massachusetts, some of which are fewer than 1,000 people, but they see changes of 10, 30, 56% in some cases, which certainly somebody could look at that and say, well, that's when the Census Bureau census results come in, they could say, well, that's not accurate, but it undermines the credibility of the census itself in small and rural communities if the results come back and don't reflect the reality that that people experience on the ground. Again, this is confirmed by Census Bureau analysis. This is a similar result, but with the percent difference for all those same counties, again, using an epsilon value of 4. And you can see that on the left there, the smallest counties had the sort of widest range of a percent difference in when comparing 2010 to the differentially private demonstration data. And, the range there doesn't seem like very much. It's, it's 1%, the median, and, the range is between, maybe 0.6 and 1.4. But these are for counties of up to 7,500 people. And so if we think about going to smaller and smaller tabulation areas where you're looking at tracts or townships that are only 1,000 or 500 people, that percent, and you're further down the hierarchy, those differences are going to get larger and larger. And therefore, the smallest jurisdictions are going to see the greatest, the sort of largest percentage different problems in terms of the accuracy of the data. We've also observed that, and others have observed that differential privacy inflates the population, or in some cases erases subsets of the population, and in particular people of color or people from smaller race and ethnic groups and school children. Again, the inaccuracy, in addition to inaccuracy being higher for small tabulation areas, inaccuracy is higher for smaller subsets of the population. And this can impede redistricting, monitoring voting rights, fair housing, and other programs that are where knowing the characteristics of certain protected classes or communities of interest is very important in order to do those things fairly. This chart here shows the percent change in the non-Hispanic Black population after the application of differential privacy. And you can see, again, in some of the smallest communities and those with small Black populations, you're seeing differences in 20, 30, up to 40, almost 40% in the Black population there. Now, those tend to be increases, but the fact of the matter is, it also suggests that it impedes the ability to delineate, say, voting districts or implement other programs in a fair way if the census results are indicating that there's large numbers of these population groups in places where they in fact don't exist. On the flip side, we see big changes also in the number of school-aged children. So this is a chart showing the change in school-aged children by school district in Massachusetts, or municipalities, I guess, but those are largely the same in our state. And there is the average Massachusetts school district saw school-age population counts change by an absolute difference of 15 percentage points. So big changes, and in many of the largest communities, you're seeing huge increases. Springfield, which is our third largest municipality, saw an increase of over 10% in the school-age population as compared to what was in 2020. And then meanwhile, Boston saw a decline of or an apparent decline of almost 3,600, or actually more than that, school-age children using differential privacy. So big changes there. And if you can imagine any one of those districts trying to plan for facilities, the number of classrooms they're going to need, various things like that, it could be a big issue if the school-age population is inaccurate. Again, the Census Bureau has done some analysis of this. This is a population pyramid for a West Virginia city of about 26,000 people. The black outlined columns there are the Census 2010 results, and then the blue and pink lines or shaded areas are what the results of differential privacy. And you can see that there's a lot of noise that's introduced to the data. Again, this is using that epsilon value of 4 that was used in the demonstration data. So big increases in some age groups, huge declines in other age groups, even ones that are right next to each other. So if you look at the 17 to 18 age group, you see that the 17-year-olds declined substantially. Actually, I think that might be 18 to 19. Many fewer 18-year-old males and many more 19-year-old males. If you go further to the left, you can see that the apparent number of 6-year-old males increased substantially from 200 to over 300. So if you were a school administrator looking at this data from 2010, all of a sudden you might be thinking, wow, I need to start adding some more classrooms. I need to start investing in boys' bathrooms and not girls, apparently. But And the result of that is going to be, big misallocation of resources to respond to data that doesn't really reflect conditions on the ground. And not just today, but it has big implications for future planning efforts. So our colleagues at the University of Massachusetts Donahue Institute, they produce population projections for the state of Massachusetts and municipalities. Those serve as the basis for transportation planning and all of our MPOs. They took and those population projections rely on net migration estimates at the municipal level that are based on, you compare the 2000 population to the 2010 population, and after accounting for births and deaths, the result is what's called a net migration figure. And so if the population in 2010 varies quite a bit, then the interpretation of how many people of a given cohort moved into or out of the community over the prior 10 years is going to change quite a bit as well. In this case, by using the 2010 differentially private data as the basis for those migration calculations and the future forecasts, it resulted in an 8% reduction in the projected 2030 population. So the forecast is for Cambridge to be smaller than it would be based on the actual population change that occurred between 2000 and 2010. Again, kind of goes back to that issue of a systemic bias against larger tabulation areas and larger cities. Cambridge is one of those that had many fewer people after using the differentially private data than not. And then you can see that there's big declines in the biggest changes in the 15 and 19-year-old population, and big changes in the number of people, big declines in the number of people expected to be over the age of, between 60 and 64, 70 and 74, and 80 and 84. So again, a municipality that's using this information, or a region that's using this information to determine, okay, what might my senior population be in the future? How do I need to plan for services? Is going to get a very distorted forecast of what what might come to pass. Now, and not to say that projections are perfect, but they're certainly better when they're based on data that actually reflect the reality on the ground in the base year. And finally, we've observed, and so have our partners, that the application of differential privacy, at least as we've seen it, produces non-credible data that's really unsuitable for program implementation. So one census block, again in Cambridge, was reported to have 27 persons per household, when the actual value in 2010 was 2 persons per household. Because of the issue of the small blocks and the fact that housing units are held constant, but households aren't. 65% of block groups in the city of Cambridge were reported to have 0 vacant housing units, which, when the actual number is much smaller than that. Some block groups that have large amounts of affordable housing were actually, they were the ones who got all the vacant housing units, and so the vacancy rate, one of the block groups with an affordable housing with public housing development, the vacancy rate increased from less than 2.5% to more than 15%, which really feeds into negative stereotypes and narratives about the vacancy of public housing units. And also, because of that, there were changes in what was the tabulation of household size, which in 2010 data was actually less than 1, but increased to 3.45. So again, that's going to have material impacts on the types of services that a municipality will seek to target to particular areas. And then, while we haven't been able to go through this in detail, I think it's quite clear that the application of differential privacy could produce major changes in eligibility for environmental justice analysis, for things like opportunity zones, or what constitutes a qualified census tract, or various other things like that, which are really going to change the dollar amount that municipalities and regions and states are eligible for, as well as the allocation of those dollars and the dollars that are received, so that they could be going to places that don't need them, and the places that do are getting less than they really need. So there's a lot of issues here. The Census Bureau is still taking comments on the program, and in a recent communication to the steering committee, a group of state experts on this topic, they did commit to continue working on these issues and recognizing that there were a lot of challenges. It's important for them to keep hearing that message, and our position is that it's important for the Census Bureau to begin hearing that message from elected officials, representatives, and senators, so that they're, know that they're paying attention. As the Census Bureau has said, it's a policy decision. It's a technical tool, but its application and how it's applied is a policy decision, and that's why we feel it's important to get our congressional delegation involved. So what are we suggesting? We have sort of 5 recommendations or performance standards that we feel the application of differential privacy should satisfy. Number 1, the Bureau has to resolve the systematic bias against complete counts and representation of more populous counties and jurisdictions in a given geographic area or geographic level. As we've seen, that bias is large cities and large tracts, and as well as the residents there, and that has to be resolved. And the Bureau must also resolve the systematically higher levels of inaccuracy for less populous areas and smaller population subgroups, so that rural areas and members of smaller subsets of the population are accurately represented, so that public agencies can accurately plan for their needs and provide services to them. Number 3, the Census Bureau has to ensure that localities have accurate and detailed data they need to plan for their own community's needs, and that includes accurate population and household counts at the neighborhood level. Could be block, it could be block group, but somehow we need to hold invariant the counts of household population and households at a very small geographic level, so that cities and towns can understand, how many students, how many households, how many vacant housing units, and so forth, in order to target programs. The Census Bureau must ensure that the data products have internal consistency necessary for constitutionally and legislatively mandated activities and programs. So we can't have, we can't have data sets that don't meet really basic goodness of fit standards and standards for defining certain program areas. And then finally, we feel that the Census Bureau has to provide a conclusive legal argument that its proposed application of differential privacy is essential to meeting its statutory privacy obligations. They've argued that that this is absolutely necessary, while also recognizing that it's a policy choice how it gets implemented, and it's our position that as we understand the Census Bureau's proposed application right now, it errs too far on the side of privacy and not enough on the provision of accurate information for localities. And we feel that the balance between privacy and accuracy needs to be set much more towards the end of the spectrum in order to provide more accurate data, so that we can plan for community needs and provide them essential services that are well informed by the best information we can get about who's living in each and every neighborhood across the country. If you would like more resources, you can visit the Census Bureau page on differential privacy. There was a workshop on the topic in December, where a number of folks who had examined the demonstration data came and showed their analyses, and Census Bureau provided a lot of updates on it. So it was a 2-day workshop. All of the presentations and video of the presentations is online. The National Conference of State Legislatures has a very comprehensive site with lots of resources on this topic and links to various other places. And rather than listing them all here, I thought I'd just send you there. And then finally, IPMS has analysis and links to process demonstration data, where you can download it and analyze it for your own community and see some of the analysis that other folks had done. Thanks very much. I'd be happy to take any questions that folks have and talk with you about how we might work together to address these issues.
Great, thank you, Tim. Folks, if you have any questions for Tim, please feel free to type them into the question area on the website. I do see a raised hand. I'm happy to unmute anybody that would like to ask their question directly. Let's see. Megan, are you on? Can we hear you? It looks to me like you're unmuted, but I'm not hearing anything. All right. So the first question that came in, Tim, is any word yet about how this will trickle down to ACS?
I'm not sure about that. I have read, I have seen that there are some plans to introduce it to the American Community Survey late in the 2020s, maybe in 2025, or perhaps the first sort of post-2020, the first ACS that doesn't overlap with the 2020 census. But in the most recent communication, the Census Bureau has indicated they're still evaluating how it would be applied in other programs, and I think they're very focused on the decennial census right now. So there's no firm timeline for it.
Okay. And is there, do you think it would be necessary for organizations to do the type of analysis you all have done, or do you think there's some value in commenting to the Census Bureau short of that analysis, but reflecting concerns about what this might mean for data going forward?
Well, I think there's an emerging consensus about what differential privacy is going to do to data products, you know, and there's been a lot of folks who have looked at the demonstration data, and I think, you know, that NCSL site that I have has links to some of those things. Certainly, it's going to have different effects in different places, and other communities that, you know, have unique conditions are going to be experience it differently. But it seems to be the consensus is that the effects kind of fall along the lines of some of the things that I've raised. So I would encourage folks to look over all, you know, check out the workshop presentations and the research that's available through the NCSL site and look at those, and then kind of make a decision if they have other questions or things they're concerned about for their own region and want to get the data and run the numbers, or if they feel like they've learned enough and now they're ready to start advocating for a set of performance measures. Because, you know, honestly, I think whether or not, you know, it's in, you know, the particular conditions, or whatever the particular conditions are in your community, I think that those sort of performance measures about having, you know, avoiding the systematic bias, avoiding the kind of contradictory or non-credible results, making sure that the data is accurate for local planning, I think those are all things we can agree on. And rather than kind of getting into the nitty-gritty technical details about how it gets implemented, I think communicating with our congressional delegation about the essential utility of census data and making sure that that gets preserved and is you know, really the critical ask right now.
Sure, absolutely. So somebody asked what NARC is planning, what action NARC is planning to take. We are certainly, Tim brought this to our attention. We've been working with him on materials that he is developing. And at this point, our role has largely been to try and do our best to make sure that organizations are hearing about this, that the known challenges and known challenges of differential privacy and the opportunities to weigh in are known. I think we'll definitely continue in that vein. I think there's still more to be done there. I would encourage everybody that's on the call to make sure that you are reaching out to your colleagues and others that may or may not have heard about this. I've been struck personally as I've raised this with people that I think are pretty well versed in some of these issues, and there does seem to be a significant data and knowledge gap about this. That there's folks that may have heard about it but don't know a whole lot about it, or in some cases maybe haven't really heard about it at all, or certainly not heard about it in this context of some of the issues that Tim raised in this. So we're going to continue certainly on the education front. We'd also be happy to consider doing some commenting ourselves, though I think in this case there's a lot of value to individual organizations doing their own comments. So we'll certainly look at some opportunities to work with folks to encourage that type of commenting as we go. So that's kind of what we plan on doing. I think is more from an educational front, but that could change, and we're happy to. We're certainly keeping our eye on this ball. I think this is an extremely important topic and one that you know, needs some more publicity, and that's certainly what we think we can do for it at the moment. So that is what we are planning to do at the moment. There was a question that Megan had about, I'm not quite sure, Megan, what your question was about.
Eric, can I just add one thing on that?
Please. Yeah, please.
Which is that we have a policy statement that that sort of mirrors the the findings here and these 5 recommendations at the end that we'll have posted on our website within the week, and we can certainly share that as well with all the attendees, and folks can use it as kind of the basis for their communications as they see fit.
That's great. Thank you. And we're happy to share that out and anything else that you guys develop, or if anybody else on the call is developing materials, obviously happy to share those around as well. I think the more that we get out there, the more we get information out there, the better from a variety of places. There was one quick question. I think this is generally about the security of the census. Tim, does this relate? I mean, this doesn't really comment per se on the security of the census. We still expect the census is a secure process. This is more about how they're interpreting or providing the data, correct?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. The confidentiality of individual census responses is, I think is something that the Bureau has done an outstanding job of protecting over the centuries, really. And nothing about differential privacy would change that, which is namely that nobody outside the Census Bureau is allowed to view a individual census response until 70 some odd years after it's been submitted. So that wouldn't change. And I think, but really this is about how the data are processed once they're all encoded and cleaned and everything, and it's all put together. What happens in that pipeline before those final tables are produced? So I think we can it's not really an issue of people of the confidentiality of the individual results themselves, but rather whether individual characteristics could be divined by examining the public data sets.
Sure. Somebody else asked or made a comment, really, and I wanted to see if you had anything to add. While DP may not be applied to the ACS until 2025 or later, there's concern that the ripple effect of the decennial results could still affect the ACS data, even if it doesn't get applied to that right away. Is that correct?
That is absolutely a concern. That's it's an excellent point. Because it serves as the basis for the population counts that exist. It's our benchmark for that. I think the other thing that I'm concerned about is, it affects ACS in a few years. Now then we get to 2030. Are we using the same form of disclosure avoidance? Is it a different form of disclosure avoidance? And then if you imagine the noise that exists in the population, like that occurred where you were using the 2000 and the 2010 population for those forecasts. What is it when you have 2 decennial censuses, both of which are perturbed, and now you're trying to, calculate net migration based on those? You could get very, very unrealistic results out of that. So there is definitely a potential for all of the errors we see to be compounded over time, to make it harder to track changes over time. I mean, I really kind of just talked about what the problem is right now, but tracking changes over time and monitoring the effectiveness of policies will be much impaired with this as well.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for that. I hate to end on sort of a depressing note like that, but I think that that last answer actually highlights the importance of this issue, not just in the very near term, but as you say, over time, the effects could really compound and really create challenges going forward. So I think that highlights the need for some attention on this issue from those that use the data and rely on it for planning and forecasting and everything else, which I think, as you noted, extends beyond even regional planning organizations and really, I think, has a much larger cohort. So hopefully others are also looking, I'm sure they are looking at this and finding ways to weigh in on this important issue. So.
Yep, that's right. And, I think we are in a delicate spot right here. I think we don't want to publicize this too broadly, because for the public, the main message should be about that responding to the census is safe and easy and important, and people, you know, like that really needs to be the core of any public messaging over the course of the next 2 or 3 months. So I don't, you know, I cringe whenever I see an editorial or a newspaper article about it, because I think it's actually quite distracting from the message that people need to get, which is that, you know, the complete count is the #1 thing that the public should be focused on. But we also need to, I think behind the scenes, it would be a great advantage if other regional entities and elected officials were reaching out to their congressional delegations, making sure that they're aware of it, raising awareness of this, you know, in that venue, so that we can, you know, that the folks in Washington who are in the House and in the Senate really understand this issue and are prepared to kind of weigh in on a policy level as the Census Bureau admits, you know, they should, which is, you know, again, it's a policy decision, and if it is, it isn't necessarily a policy that has to be made inside the Census Bureau, but by elected representatives in Washington.
Absolutely. Well, there's no other questions. So with that, I will say thank you very, very much, Tim. Much appreciate your focus on this and your ongoing efforts in this regard. Look forward to working with you. And for the folks on the line, we will certainly keep our eye on this and continue to share out information through various channels, including eRegions and Transportation Thursdays on this going forward. So thanks, Tim, and thanks for all for joining us today.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.